dun dun do 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 dun dun do da 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 dun dun do 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 dun dun do da da.
Al hashod, al hakeshet, al agdi, mehuma. Al aryeh, al masnayim, al hadli, milchama, al dagim, krav vishnayim, levana, bechama, betula, mistaeret, al tala, besartan, teumim, bemachteret, imakrav, mesukan, esh bashamayim shalevet me'al, nogavet zedek tovim bechalal, zodiac sovev mistovev hagalgal, mehuma, kachomnam, ben adam, mistovev, ba'olam, bli kochav, bli mazal, mefor lesham, esh bashamayim shalevet me'al, nogavet zedek tovim bechalal, zodiac sovev mistovev hagalgal, mehuma. Shamayim shalevet me'al, nogavet zedek tovim bechalal, zodiac sovev mistovev hagalgal, mehuma. Esh bashamayim shalevet me'al, nogavet zedek tovim bechalal, zodiac sovev mistovev hagalgal, mehuma. Esh bashamayim, esh bashamayim, oh, esh.
Thank you all so much. My name is Derek. I am the president of Rhythm and Jews this year, and well, it's been a huge quarter for us. We've got a bunch of new members. Raise your hands, kids. Aren't they adorable? I love them. We've also just released an album last spring. You can check that out on Spotify, iTunes, and any other music distribution platforms you kids use these days. Yeah, otherwise, if you like our sound, you can catch us here again at the ICCA quarterfinals, this very stage in the winter. Aka fans over there. Otherwise, we got one more song for you tonight, and we hope you enjoy the debate.
Look up at the sky. It's a full moon on the Sabbath. This is scary. Woof.
Here's my tale. I was working on my Haftorah when I heard a knock on my bedroom door. I opened it up, and to my surprise, there was a werewolf standing there with glowing gold eyes. He said,
"Tomorrow, my son, you will be a man, but tonight is the night to join the Wolven clan. Tomorrow you will stand at the bima and pray, but tonight let's gaze at the moon and bay. Werewolf bar mitzvah, spooky, scary. Boys becoming men, and men becoming wolves.
Werewolf bar mitzvah, spooky, scary. Boys becoming men, and men becoming wolves. The next day, what happened? The Talmud didn't teach. I got up in front of everyone to give my little speech. But my teeth turned into fangs, and my nails turned into claws, and I nearly dropped the Torah when my hands turned into paws. I cried and I roared. My rabbi did as well. 'Twas a rocking werewolf zoo at Temple Emmanuel. At my werewolf bar mitzvah, spooky, scary.
Spooky, scary skeletons and shivers down your spine. Werewolf bar mitzvah, spooky, scary. Boys becoming men and men becoming wolves.
We had a reception at the Larchmont Country Club. They served a real nice brisket and an 8-foot party sub. Danced with my cousins, got money from my folks.
And we had a lot of fun telling circumcision jokes.
But the country club employees were a brain-sucking pack
Who had all turned into zombies and were on the attack.
So we fought them.
And some Draculas.
And Frankensteins too.
You know you gotta love bar mitzvahs even if you're not
Werewolf bar mitzvah, spooky, scary. Boys becoming men,
scary.
and men becoming wolves. Werewolf bar mitzvah, spooky, scary. Boys becoming
Werewolf bar mitzvah, spooky, scary. Nice Jewish boys go woof, woof, woof.
Werewolf bar mitzvah,
and becoming wolves.
Good evening and welcome, everyone. My name is Anna Levin-Rose, and I'm the rabbi and the executive director at the University of Chicago Hillel. Woo! And I'm excited to welcome you to the 70th annual Latke-Hamantash Debate. Yes, you heard that correctly. 70 years. What a long time for such a silly tradition. How did it last? How did it manage to survive so long at an esteemed university like University of Chicago, which is known for much seriousness and rigorous inquiry? Well, let's start at the very beginning. The untold story. It was 1946, and the first debate was divisive and vitriolic in the Hillel house. Latke and Hamantash were locked in angry debate, and then their eyes locked. And they stole away upstairs to Rabbi Pekarsky's office on the second floor of the Hillel building, and standing by the large oak desk in the moonlight, they were married. Married, you say? That's impossible. No, it's not. How could two seemingly polarized individuals marry when the debate continues raging on? In 1946, We were more concerned with coming together rather than creating divisions in our community. Latke and Hamantash knew that despite their differences and the disapproval of their friends and family, they were meant to be together. So they decided to keep their marriage a secret as they both set off to pursue doctorates in their respective fields. They knew that the news of their matrimony would cause no end of grief and consternation in their families, so they decided to keep their elopement in the shadows, but keep the debate raging each autumn. As you might imagine, this was not an easy arrangement to maintain, given the stress that two working academics undergo. Working academics with opposite points of view. Latke and Hamantash found valuable mentors and learned a lesson of how to stay together in the 1968 when they attended a peace rally in Washington, D.C. It was there that they met an elderly couple, gefilte fish and matzo ball, who had a similar star-crossed lover vibe in their relationship. Gefilte and matzo ball told Latke and Hamantash to keep their arguments centralized to one debate a year. And with this practice in place, the Latke and the Hamantash were able to maintain their loving relationship throughout the year with minimal animosity. They were able to save their blowout arguments confined to the month of November. The Latke and the Hamantash kept up the debate tradition without a hitch until the 1980s, when Hamantash's successful academic career began to surpass that of Latke. In 1989, Hamantash was awarded an honorary doctorate from the University of Chicago in recognition of her advanced work in the theory of international astroparticle biochemical physics of Jewish foods. Meanwhile, Latke served as an untenured adjunct faculty in the applied studies of international astroparticle biochemical physics. Latke was initially envious of Hamantash's career success. He wanted to be the primary oil winner in the family. But eventually he came to take much pride in taking care of the baby potato knishes at home. So by now you're probably wondering, why are you disclosing all of this at this moment? Latke and Hamantash have managed to keep this a secret for 70 years. This is true. But they asked me to share their story with you tonight in honor of their platinum anniversary. We live in stressful, busy, bustling times in an ever-changing world, and it's important to recognize examples in real life, such as that of Latke and Hamantash, where people with divergent opinions still manage to love each other. But more than that, the love is strengthened by the annual traditional debate, full of academically rigorous, strategic, and well-researched arguments. With that said, ladies and gentlemen, all of you, I urge you to keep an open mind and a loving heart to the arguments presented tonight. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the debate.
Esteemed guests, colleagues, friends, those of you who neither esteemed nor my colleagues, nor my friends. Welcome to the 70th annual Latke-Hamantash Debate at the University of Chicago. This is the original Latke-Hamantash Debate, and it is still the undisputed world heavyweight champion of Latke-Hamantash Debates. My name is Hal Weitzman, and I work at the University of Chicago Booth School of Business as the Executive Director for Intellectual Capital. I often get asked what that title actually means. It's really quite simple. I direct the school's intellectual capital, and I do so in an executive manner. Over its 70 years, this debate has shaped American culture. Long before people talked about the dangers of political polarization, the Latke-Hamantash divide was a critical line of cleavage in American society. And yet some people are still apparently unaware of what this is all about. A colleague emailed me a couple of weeks ago to ask whether I would be arguing tonight in favor of latkes or ham. So one of my roles here is to explain what the hell is going on, to provide something of a guide for the perplexed, if you will. I'm pretty perplexed myself, but let's give it a try. So first, let's define our terms. What are latkes? What are hamantaschen? Well, a hamantash is a very cute three-cornered cake or cookie stuffed with poppy seeds, fruit preserves, or young children, and traditionally eaten on the Jewish holiday of Purim. A latke is a fried potato pancake traditionally eaten on the Jewish holiday of Hanukkah. So what, you may ask, are Purim and Hanukkah? These minor festivals are fascinating in their own right, but let me summarize their significance by bringing a very beautiful devar, a teaching from Rav Zalman Menachem Tovia Zindel, Zichron Livrocha, an 18th century luminary from the Polish shtetl of Glitz. Rav Zalman was known, as is the tradition, by his acronym, made from his initials, the razzmatazz of Glitz. In his famous book of Torah exegesis, Lasim al Haglitz, in English, Putting on the Glitz, he wrote, and pardon my Yiddish here, Tu on a chaza a streimel, vete vern rof, which roughly translates as, Purim is the Jewish Halloween, and Hanukkah is the Jewish Christmas. Of course, as with any Jewish position, other rabbis vehemently disagreed with him, with one particularly strident view holding that Purim is in fact more like Easter, which explains the bunnies. So why is this debate still going on after 70 years? Well, because arguing about food combines two Jewish obsessions. Jews can get pretty excited about food. Even a discussion about which challah to cut on the Shabbos table, the long one or the round one, can get extremely heated. You may already be confused, but for those who are following, indulge me one more mivta, one more nuance. According to Jewish folklore, this lot are the good guys. Look at the shape of their hats. Round. Haman, the evil character in the Purim story, by contrast, wore a triangular hat, as this historically accurate sketch demonstrates. Indeed, that is why the Hamantash is triangular, to remind us of Haman. So a triangular hat typically is worn by an anti-Semite, while other headgear is worn by Jews or friends of the Jews. Let's look at some examples. Shall we look at some examples? Okay. Bad guy ringing bell. Good guy. Good guy ringing chicken. Clearly evil. Good. Jew hater. Jew. Bad man. Lovely boy chick. Wants to kill Jews. Wants to snuggle with Jews. Not sure what's going on here. Again, not sure what's going on here. Enemy of the Jews from Wisconsin. Friend of the Jews from Illinois. Again, I'm not sure about this one. Not sure about this one either. I think this one is okay. Really not sure about this one. This is interesting. But then I realized so you get the idea. This is a fractious debate at the end of a fractious election campaign. It would be foolhardy so soon after such a tumultuous race to reopen the wounds at a time when we should be letting America heal. But of course, that's exactly what we're going to do. So here's the question. If we were to correlate the two presidential contenders with our two debate foods, who would be what? First, Donald Trump. In looking for a clue as to where he might lean, we need to remember that the miracle of Hanukkah is not so much about shredded potatoes, but more about the oil in which they are fried. Trump, of course, loves oil. and he wants to wage war to grab more of it. And even after a hard-fought election campaign, he still has millions of gallons of snake oil left. Perfect for filling the menorah. Of course, the Latke love makes sense when you consider the aim of making America great again. And just as I was coming into tonight's event, I received an email update with the news that President-elect Trump is considering nominating a Latke to be his ambassador to Israel, and that he expects the Latke to solve the Arab-Israeli dispute bigly. So if Trump is a Latke guy, then Hillary Clinton, here being given the stink eye for daring to try to touch a Sefer Torah, is a Hamantash natural. The Clintons, after all, were known for their triangulation strategy, so expertly explained in this enlightening chart from Wikipedia. If anyone had any doubts about her leanings, I can show to you this text message I received today from her top aide's estranged husband, disgraced politician Anthony Weiner, congratulating the University of Chicago on holding its 70th Latke-Hamantash Debate. And in case you can't see it, here's that thong in more detail. It's traditional at the Latke-Hamantash Debate for the moderator to give an exposition involving gematria, Jewish numerology. Gematria is a way of divining deeper meaning from Hebrew words by attaching a number to each of the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet, the Aleph Bet, and manipulating them to extract some profound significance. So if we take our two presidential candidates, the letters of Clinton in Hebrew give a value of 255, while Trump gives 330. Don't jump ahead. Now, as it happens, both these numbers are highly significant in Judaism. In the year 255 BCE, for example, Antiochus II defeated Ptolemy and married his daughter Berenice. Ptolemy's daughter, I mean, not his own daughter. This couple's grandson, so that's Antiochus II, this couple's grandson, Antiochus IV, was the same Antiochus IV against whom the Maccabees rebelled, which is the basis for the Hanukkah story. But what about the gematria? What other Hebrew words have the same value as Clinton's name, the number 255? And here we have me'achor, behind, which is what she was ultimately. Etzba Elohim, finger of the Lord, which maybe explains the manic pointing. And Ein Tzedek, there's no justice. Okay, let's turn to you-know-who. So 330 is another highly significant number to Jews. It's actually the number of medieval Jews who are apparently to blame for producing the entire mass of today's Ashkenazim. Especially significant tonight, of course, when we celebrate these two staples of Ashkenazi cuisine. But again, let's look for a deeper meaning in the gematria of 330, Trump's name. And I want to emphasize before I do this, there is nothing political about these results. This is merely what the gematria reveals. So with that disclaimer, we get a kal-kal, devious, bechachash, deceitful, and meitzer, depressed. But enough of this nonsense. Let's proceed with tonight's main event, the debate. It's my pleasure to introduce these four fantastic debaters. Our first speaker tonight is Wendy Friedman, the John and Marian Sullivan University Professor of Astronomy and Astrophysics. Professor Friedman was a co-leader of the team that carried out the Hubble Space Telescope Key Project and established the Hubble constant, the universe's expansion rate. As such, she is acutely aware of how insignificant life on Earth really is. And that is exactly why she's decided to dedicate herself to the things that really make a difference, like tonight's debate. Professor Friedman.
I am honored to have been asked to participate in an event of such cosmic and comic importance, and concerning a matter about which I am supremely qualified to speak. In that connection, I note a very, very serious omission on the part of the organizers of the Latke-Hamantash Debate. In the 69 years prior to this debate, not a single astronomer has ever been asked to participate. I think it's a shanda, a scandal. The field of astronomy, probably the second oldest profession, has evidence of cosmic significance that has been excluded from this debate. I embrace controversial subjects. As a member of the Canadian Jewish community of Toronto, I grew up in culinary and cultural controversy. In my grandparents' home, dinner arguments were in a combination of English, Yiddish, and Canadian beaver grunts. And I had to learn to distinguish those three languages. Sometimes the debates were so heated that our igloo started to melt. Yet, you should be aware that my late grandmothers, Heike and Rivka, would likely be plotzing if they were here, embarrassed by the very notion that I would be called to speak about anything related to cooking or baking. They both tried valiantly to teach me our wonderful family recipes for the holidays, but this was an area in which I did not excel. Never mind that I wanted to study astrophysics. Enough with this mishigas. Craziness that would for sure seal my fate as an alta moida, never to find a husband. My recollection, sorry, Mom and Dad, if you're watching this live streaming, I apologize. My recollection was that these recipes went something along the lines of, add a bissel of flour until it looks right. Well, how many ounces are in a bissel? Approximately, how much is that? New, until the texture is right and you can roll the dough. Yes, but how much is that? Oy vey, or oy vey, as we say in Canada. Let me do it. You are no help. Years later, I still struggle to make dough. I don't think I've ever gotten the consistency right for my grandmother's Hamantaschen. Fortunately, cooking and baking were not required prerequisites for astrophysics. After university, I immigrated to the US. In those days, there was no wall between our countries. Not even a fence. I crossed the border in broad daylight with a few other Jewish scientists, some hockey players like Wayne Gretzky, some comedians you may have heard of, John Candy, Dan Aykroyd, Jim Carrey, Mike Myers, and Ted Cruz. Seeking opportunities in a land that embraces immigrants. 35 years of research in astronomy has prepared me for this debate. I can state unequivocally that I am the only person who has participated in these debates qualified to give a complete recipe for either latkes or hamentaschen. It requires patience to make either latkes or hamentaschen. In fact, 13.7 billion years of patience are required to create the necessary ingredients. Here is a complete recipe for latkes and hamentaschen. Preheat the universe in the Big Bang to about 1,000 trillion degrees Celsius. From the primordial chicken soup, create hydrogen and helium, hydrogen being an essential ingredient for water. Then expand and cool the universe for 1 billion years to allow the formation of stars. Zimmer. Oops. I meant simmer. Simmer. Add a bissel of supernova explosions. See, Booby, I learned something. Stir in more star formation, this time with heavy elements. We need sodium and chlorine to make salt, without which cooking is not very interesting. Add a dollop of planet formation. Next, a sprinkle of microbial life. Poppies and potatoes. And don't forget the magic ingredient, boobies. And then, and only then, do we get the recipe we're all familiar with. For latkes, we preheat the oil. For hamentaschen, we preheat the oven. And you can look at the rest of it up on Google if you don't know the recipe. But now you have the complete recipe. Let's examine the ingredients for latkes. The first ingredient is potatoes. After God created the potato, he was so enamored by this perfect form that he decided to sprinkle them throughout the universe. I think these look good enough to eat. Turns out that in our solar system, there is a ready supply for latkes. The first two images are NASA images from the asteroid belt. Astronomy tells us that potatoes are the perfect ingredient, the key to heavenly taste. Now, you might disagree, but good luck with free expression, even at the University of Chicago. God has spoken. Back to the debate at hand. I will examine the evidence, both historical and recent, for astronomical clues to the question of latkes versus hamentaschen. I will make 4 arguments. 1, Galileo Galilei is known both as the father of modern astronomy and of modern physics, and he was a well-known connoisseur of Jewish cooking. He was the first to make an astronomical telescope and to look upward at the sky, and not only to look at the sky, but to record and interpret what he saw. In poring over his notebooks of 1609, I have been able to reveal an overlooked discovery. In addition to discovering the moons of Jupiter, the phases of Venus, spots on the sun, Galileo's notebooks contain hand-drawn and beautiful drawings of latkes. Imagine his surprise when he looked up into the heavens and saw a beautiful, textured, and bubbly image of a hot latke as the batter hits the frying pan and it turns a golden brown. Here is an image from Galileo's notebook. The phases of making latkes. Galileo wrote, "I render infinite thanks to God for being so kind as to make me alone the first observer of marvels kept hidden in obscurity for all previous centuries." I, too, now know how he felt. 2. Edwin Hubble changed forever our perception of the universe that we live in. In the 1920s, a debate was raging in the astronomical community. This debate predated our prestigious Latke-Hamantash Debate, and it was almost equally well known, i.e., completely unknown outside of the University of Chicago. Edwin Hubble himself began his distinguished academic career at the University of Chicago. He set out to study the nature of a class of astronomical objects known as nebulae. A person who devotes their life to the study of nebulae is known as a nebulish. That's to be distinguished from the Yiddish word nebbish, which means pitifully ineffectual, luckless, and timid. You don't want to be a nebbish. Hubble was not a nebbish. In fact, he was a superb athlete. He played basketball for the University of Chicago, he was a Rhodes Scholar, and he rose to the rank of colonel in World War I. So remember, he was a nebulish, not a nebbish. At the heart of the debate was the question, were these objects nearby new stars in the process of forming, or were they distant island universes on their own? Using the most powerful telescopes in the world, Hubble made a monumental discovery. In the words of my famous late astronomical colleague, Carl Sagan, also a University of Chicago alum, Hubble discovered that the universe is filled with billions and billions of galatkes. Hubble found further evidence that these galaxies, as the galatkes are now referred to, are taking part in a global expansion of the entire universe. You think I'm kidding? But I checked the Yiddish-English dictionary for galaxy. Galatke. And for the young skeptics among you, most of you are not fluent in Yiddish, I double-checked with the indisputable source of all knowledge, Google. Galatke. Okay, close enough, Galatke. Even with the powerful Hubble Space Telescope, and I've spent much of my career observing with it, you don't see latke-hamentaschen or any other astronomical objects resembling three-cornered pastries with filling. Albert Einstein was so intrigued by Hubble's discoveries that he traveled to Pasadena, California, and to nearby Mount Wilson, home of the telescope Hubble had used. And Hubble let Einstein peer through the telescope. I looked for a reference to see if Einstein had waded in on the Latke-Hamantash Debate, or if there was a picture of Einstein in the Einstein archives showing his enjoying either latkes or Hamentaschen, but I could find no clues. On this important question, Einstein did not leave us his answer. Although I think one could make the argument that he was reacting to eating a Hamantash, but we'll debate that later. 3. Arno Penzias and Robert Wilson of the Bell Laboratories in New Jersey made a discovery for which they were awarded the Nobel Prize in 1965. If the universe had a beginning hot enough to make the ingredients for latkes and hamentaschen, then a relic of this Big Bang radiation should be observable today, cooled to a temperature of 3 degrees above absolute zero. Penzias and Wilson discovered this background radiation, and modern measurements have now mapped this background to extraordinary precision. So here is a satellite image of the sky in microwaves. The color scheme is, of course, entirely false. It is intended simply to convey regions of the universe that are colder, in blue, than others, in red. The astronomers who chose this particular color scheme, however, have missed the opportunity to make a profound discovery. Clearly, evidence that the cosmos resembles a giant latke. Finally, 4. Yeah, this audience gets ahead of you. I guess you are familiar with the 27-kilometer-long tunnel in the countryside running underground near the Swiss-French border outside of Geneva. It is known as the LHC, or Latke-Hamantash cooker. It is here that the World Wide Web was created in the early 1990s, presumably when Al Gore went there to learn of experiments intended to answer the question of which is better, latkes or hamentaschen. Test particles, latkes and hamentaschen, are being smashed into each other at astronomical energies, accelerated to nearly the speed of light, creating showers of particles in order to learn about the fundamental constituents of matter. A host of other particles appear very briefly, particles that have not been seen since the Big Bang 13.7 billion years ago. What do we see from these collisions? Well, like the childhood game, which of these images is not like the other? Shower of particles created in the Latke-Hamantash cooker, a latke, a hamantash. A 3-year-old could answer this question. You don't need a PhD scientist. Sure, the LHC discovered the Higgs boson, whatever that is. But I say Higgs schmigs. The great discovery justifying the modest investment in the LHC of $10 billion was that just as the cosmos is full of potatoes, the submicroscopic world is shaped like a latke. And so I rest my case. Clearly, the empirical evidence from astronomy and physics gathered over a period of centuries indicates that the cosmos has a preference for latkes over hamentaschen. We see it on all scales, from the smallest particles to our asteroid belt filled with potatoes, to an expanding world of galatkes, and an imprint of latkes on the grandest scale, that of the universe itself. Thank you very much.
Our next debater is David Nirenberg. In his 2013 book, Anti-Judaism, the Western Tradition, Professor Nirenberg argues that the ancient Egyptians may have created their own pro-Egyptian version of Passover. According to this version, Egypt was invaded by pillaging, murderous shepherds who destroyed temples and sacred images before they were resisted. That sounds more like Hanukkah than Passover to me, but perhaps we have Egyptians to thank for the ultimate Pesach-Hanukkah hybrid food, matzah brai. David Nirenberg is Dean of the Division of Social Sciences and the Deborah and Edgar Janota Professor of Medieval History and Social Thought. He also holds an academic appointment in the college and 5 academic appointments across the social sciences and humanities divisions. Given all that, we're delighted he can spare the time to join us tonight. Professor Nirenberg.
I can't tell you how amazing it is. This is the achievement of a lifetime. When you get the call, I apologize to the Nobels in the audience, but this is the Nobel Prize of the University of Chicago. So you can imagine, I was elated. I thought to myself, finally, I can work on problems more important than the ones I've been spending my life on, relations between Muslims, Christians, and Jews over time. Finally, I could take on the really significant questions of the universe. And then I suddenly realized, and this hit me like a hammer between the eyes, I'm a dean. I don't know if those of you who are not faculty members know this, but deans are not allowed to think for themselves. So what was I going to do? I couldn't stand up here and talk about overhead and IDCs and space allocations. And so I thought to myself, wait a minute. If there's one thing a dean can do, it's harass his faculty. And I have the greatest faculty in the world, the faculty of the Division of the Social Sciences. The faculty of the Division of the Social Sciences is incredibly diverse. We work on everything from archaeology to, well, to some parts of zoology. We work on Machiavelli. In fact, Hannah Gray once stood here and proved to you that Machiavelli was a Latke maven. We work on MRIs. We actually co-run the MRI Research Center with the Biological Sciences Division. And we can tell you through our MRIs which one of these images is the image of a brain on latkes and which one is the image of a brain on Hamantaschen. We have very important projects in energy. So I'm thinking here of the Energy Policy Institute Chicago and the Climate Impact Lab and its Social Cost of Carbon project. And I thought to myself, oh, this is perfect, right? Both of these foodstuffs are energy intensive. And I hypothesized that I could go to my colleagues at the Climate Impact Lab and the Energy Policy Institute Chicago and ask them questions like, and this is really an obvious question, some of the Latke-driven negative externalities of global oil demand. But Hamantaschen should not feel cocky here, pardon the pun, because after all, baking requires combustible elements, usually natural gas nowadays, fracking, all kinds of environmental consequences. I immediately thought to myself, I'll call Michael Greenstone, the Milton Friedman Professor of Economics and the Director of the Energy Policy Institute Chicago and the Climate Impact Lab, and I'll ask him about questions like these. So I called him up right away. I said, so have you done research on the negative externalities of latkes and oil demand? He said, no. I asked him about fracking and Hamantash, and he said, I don't know what Hamantaschen are. So I said, and then I thought, oh, look, the Milton Friedman Professor of Economics, at least I can ask him the only question anyone at the University of Chicago cares about. Did Milton Friedman prefer latkes or Hamantaschen? He hung up on me. Then I realized, I thought back on Borat, Michael Moore, Colbert, Jon Stewart. If there's one thing no professor can resist, it's the invitation to be on a talk show. So, here's my talk show with some of the greatest minds of the social sciences division, which means, of course, some of the greatest minds of the University of Chicago. I hope you enjoy it as much as I enjoyed making it. My guest today is Kathy Cohen, the David and Mary Winton Green Professor of Political Science. Now, you have since also undertaken a very innovative survey-type project in collaboration with the National Opinion Research Center, NORC, and that's the Gen Forward project. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Happy to. Gen Forward is kind of the first of its kind monthly survey of young people or young millennials, 18 to 30. We have oversamples of African Americans, Latinos, and Asian Americans, so it is representative of the millennial generation, which is probably the most racially and ethnically diverse generation that we've seen. And we also want to remember that millennials are now the largest generation, so larger than baby boomers.
And hard to access through conventional survey techniques.
Absolutely.
Could you tell a little bit about the work you've done with Gen Forward? Have you actually asked that panel anything about our question today?
We have, and let me say that again we see a divide between Latkes and Hamantash, with young people of color much more likely to kind of say that they prefer Latkes, and young whites who feel politically alienated, we might say, saying they prefer the kind of sweetness, the kind of nostalgia of Hamantash. But I will say that both groups still have a level of alienation that we've never seen to these two food groups before, right? And in fact, they're kind of focused really on a third candidate that seemed more sustainable, that seemed more in line with the goals of their generation. And many of them said that they would prefer a bagel to either the Latke or the Hamantash.
A bagel to either Latke or the Hamantash? This is actually quite a revolutionary turn.
I agree.
Does it have implications for the long-term consequences of our foods groups?
Well, I think it means that both those who produce Latkes and those who produce Hamantash will have to begin to think about how to incorporate some of the kind of making of bagels into their food products, right? So that they can apply and appeal to this new generation of eaters who in fact will dominate the country in the years to come. Absolutely.
Now, one of the things we know about surveys is that they're incredibly complex to administer. You mentioned oversampling,
yes,
which is a technical term that our audience may not be aware of.
Right.
And it also really matters the confidence intervals, and it's also how you frame the questions. I wonder, do you have a kind of margin of error for the Gen Forward oversampling on the Latke-Hamantash issue?
Right. The margin of error is about 4 to 5%. However, the differences in terms of preferences, in particular for young people of color, were well outside the margin of error. So I think we have great confidence in the divide and the finding that I reported. Our questions, again, were as rigorous and objective as possible. So we asked a question like, would you prefer the kind of savory, delicious sweetness and saltiness of a latke to a kind of muddled, sweet, ruin your teeth Hamantash, as a way to make sure, in fact, that both presentations were there and that there was neutral,
totally
no bias in terms of how I thought about the question, because it's very important to me, being a faculty member here at the University of Chicago, that I lead with objectivity and rigor always.
Well, this is the kind of data-driven public opinion research for which the Political Science Department at the University of Chicago is justly famous. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Our guest today is Professor Cuthbert Binns, the Clio Professor of History at the University of Chicago. So we're very honored to have him here to talk to us about the Latke versus the Hamantaschen. Professor Binns, how does a historian think about food? What does it mean to do the history of food? There are social historians, cultural historians, environmental historians, historians of religion, historians of food, all of these different approaches need to be taken into account, economic historians even, if we want to think about the Latke and the Hamantash. So in terms of the debate between Latke and Hamantash, how would a historian think about the material constraints on the two? From a materialist point of view, I would want to ask, what are the conditions of production of the Latke versus the Hamantash? Now, in the Middle Ages, the Hamantash, which is baked, would have required access to forests, to wood, to material to burn, much of which was seigneurially controlled. You've heard, of course, from Robin Hood, for example, of the royal forest, the seigneurial forest. On the other hand, the latke, which requires oil, would really have been preferably a food in the south, in the zone of olive growth. For in the north, where you didn't have olive oil, it would have needed to be cooked in butter or animal fat, which sounds disgusting. Professor Binns, does it make any difference to your historical analysis that the potato wasn't introduced into Europe until after the discovery of America and after the end of the Middle Ages? Thank you for joining us, Professor Binns. We very much appreciate your historical expertise. I'm here with Leslie Kay, a professor of psychology at the University of Chicago.
My research works primarily with rats, although we do foray into mice and sometimes humans. We study how the olfactory system constructs an internal view of the world from the animal's perspective.
So you're interested in how rats perceive sensory stimuli, particularly odor,
right,
and how context and experience affect their perception of odor.
Yes.
Do latkes and hamantaschen have odor?
They do, and it's really interesting because latkes, you get the odor while you're in the area of where you're eating, right? So you cook them and serve them kind of at the same time. Where hamantaschen, you cook them the day before.
So there's a separation of sensory experiences, is what you're saying.
Right, right.
Have you worked at all with rats on this question of how they experience that separation?
We do, actually. We train them to recognize an odor, like it could be just a latke odor, and then test them the next day on whether or not they recognize that in the context of having, eaten something quite rewarding. And in the case of the rats, it's sugar. But for humans, it could be, a delicious latke.
Let me just get this straight. From the series of questions I've asked you, I would deduce that you feel that latkes are more beneficial to rats than hamantaschen are. Is that correct?
Yeah. I mean, it's a richer sensory experience, I think, and so more pleasurable and better.
Well, I don't know if that's an endorsement, but it's a vote for latkes from the Institute for Mind and Biology and from the research labs of Leslie Kay in the Department of Psychology. Thank you very much for joining us. So I am here with Marshall Solins, the Charles F. Gray Distinguished Service Professor Emeritus of Anthropology and of Social Sciences. You knew Claude Lévi-Strauss.
Yes, I did.
Now, Claude Lévi-Strauss is famous, amongst many other things, for having written books like The Raw and the Cooked, Honey and Ashes, books that were, from which structuralism drew its name and that were focused on food. Also great books on kinship. My question to you is, did Claude Lévi-Strauss prefer latkes or did he prefer hamantaschen?
I didn't know him that well to ask that question. But in any case, what I want to talk about is more derivative from Lévi-Strauss when we come to food, and that's Mary Douglas, actually.
Oh, the great anthropologist.
The great social anthropologist from Britain, who wrote a lot about about actually the Old Testament. And I want to take off from something that she wrote of what's called the Abominations of Leviticus. It's in her book Purity and Danger. And I think it's relevant to the Hamantash-Latke distinction.
How is it relevant?
Well, if I can show you on the board, actually.
Oh, please.
You know that the Hamantash is a triangle, and the Latke is a kind of a round circle. Now, any anthropologist would know that we're dealing with a fundamental kinship convention where triangles are male and circles are female. So we can call this Hamantash and Latke, and you know, we do things like this. So this would be a marriage between them, and this would be, well, actually, there's something going wrong here. Their offspring. An offspring that immediately calls into question this whole relationship because it's a hybrid, which is in Jewish tradition an abomination. So we have a problem here. This is clearly a misalliance in the Jewish tradition. And one of two things in that case. Either it's too distant, that is like a marriage with a Gentile, or it's too close, it's incest. It's not likely to be incest for a couple of reasons. One is that the partners are too different. They couldn't be very much from the same family, since one is baked and the other is fried. One is triangular, the other is round. One is sweet and the other is salty, and so on. So the chances are that one of these two people is a Gentile.
How do we know which one? And is that
and how do we know which
or
one?
A good thing?
Yeah, now we have to find out which one. I think it's easy, pretty easy. First of all, Haman by the other equinoctial calendar holiday, Purim, is obviously an enemy. Hamantash is actually a reference to Haman in many biblical or Talmudic commentaries about these matters. Moreover, since we're talking about Jewish tradition, we wouldn't be interested in this unless it was a Jewish tradition. And it's obvious that in the Jewish tradition, you have to be born of a Jewish woman to be Jewish. So she is obviously Jewish, and he is apparently not Jewish. Not only is he an enemy by Purim, but latke, I think, is a preferred food in many ways.
I want to thank you for representing a field of inquiry, anthropology, that has a storied past here at the university. Before I let you go, I just need a clear statement. Whose side are you on here?
Well, obviously, I'm on Latke's side. I mean, Hamantash is not Jewish.
I give you Marshall Solins. My guest today is Professor James Heckman, the Henry Schultz Distinguished Service Professor in the Department of Economics. You have a work in progress, a fascinating paper called The Dynamic Model of Health, Addiction, Education, and Wealth.
Exactly. This is very relevant to the debate.
Yeah, in fact, it's also very University of Chicago, because you start with a rational addiction model that Gary Becker and Kevin Murphy developed in 1988, right?
Correct, yes. We start with that and build on it.
In which
and test it, actually.
Combine unhealthy, addictive goods, right?
Correct. Smoking or eating foods that are not very healthy, yes.
And then you go on in that paper to evaluate the impact of revenue-neutral excise taxes on unhealthy goods.
Yes, correct.
So, and you show that the accumulation of addiction capital stock is governed by past history and is cumulative over time.
Yes.
So my question to you is, could you quantify, since you've shown us that the nutritional value of Hamantaschen is actually detrimental to education, attention, etc.
In these early childhood
settings.
Correct, yes.
and that it's addictive.
Yes.
Could you quantify, through your rational addiction model, the cost to society, or let's say the benefit to society, of using latkes as snacks in early childhood education?
Yes, actually this is a research area. We're right at the frontier in this particular area. And the reason is, it's well documented. See, one of the great themes of the University of Chicago social science is how it straddles across the discipline. It's not just social science. You know, the old statement, I think, that Hayek made, the only person an economist who only does economics is not a very good economist. Here we're borrowing from the biology and borrowing from the work on nutrition. And what we found, and what's been found in the literature, is that sugar is far more addictive than other kinds of foods. So if you were to make a comparison, just to calibrate our model, this model of addiction, where consuming this food, sugar in this case, in the form of the Hamantaschen, and also the flour. The flour is no good because that's turning into sugar as well. So that by itself is creating issues about health down the road, but it's also building a much greater addictive taste than, for example, the savory food, even the one that's more fat-based. Taxing this triangle turns out to have a welfare benefit in terms of health and addiction. And behavior. So we're going to have less obesity, we're going to have greater health, much less diabetes. I mean, no question, consuming sugar and the flour that goes into the Hamantaschen. These are
educational outcomes.
Much better educational outcomes, but also a bunch of other outcomes. Health, education, participation in crime, I would argue, the ability to focus, self-control in a variety of areas of life. So if you start early on this addictive process of consuming sugar, it's going to be very hard when you're in your 30s or 40s to stop this process. And then the process of obesity will continue, the health problems will flourish, and then society will have missed a great option for improving the life of its children.
You heard it here. Data-driven policy analysis from the Center for Economics of Human Development and its director, James Heckman. Many thanks.
Okay, thank you.
I'm here with Professor Solomon Hagel from the Committee on Social Thought at the University of Chicago. Professor Solomon Hagel is a distinguished authority on fundamental texts of the Western tradition, and we're here to find out what he thinks about Latke and Hamantaschen. Could you perhaps begin by giving us some idea of what the Committee on Social Thought is? That is a very difficult question. The committee was formed by John Neff, after whom it's named, in the 1930s and 40s in order to attract great minds. Professor Hagel, does the Committee on Social Thought have a position on Latke versus Hamantaschen? Latke versus Hamantaschen. Well, you have to understand that the Committee on Social Thought is concerned with fundamental texts and fundamental questions. I can't think of any mention of a Latke or of a Hamantaschen in the texts that interest us. So, Professor Hagel, are you telling us that the Committee on Social Thought and its approach to fundamental texts can tell us nothing about Latkes or Hamantaschen? Oh, no. Certainly, social thought has something to say about Latkes and Hamantaschen. We have something to say about everything. Amongst the pre-Socratics, we would either say that Latke and Hamantaschen were actually both the same thing, since there is only oneness and sameness. I'm thinking here, obviously, of Parmenides. Or we could say with Heraclitus that there is no one thing called a Latke or called a Hamantash, that they are constantly becoming different unto themselves. You cannot bite into the same Latke twice. And then if I start to think about our other fundamental guiding star in the Committee on Social Thought, I'm speaking of Hegel, of course, I'd have to say that the problem looks somewhat similar. That is to say, you might begin with this antithesis that you seem to be posing to us here between a latke and a Hamantaschen, or a Hamantash, is that the singular? But in the end, these antitheses sublate and become one. All right, Professor Hegel, just if you could just tell me in one sentence then, do you come down on the side of the latke or on the side of the Hamantash? Well, I would have to say either or. Either. You keep returning to the thing in itself. I tell you, we're not interested in the thing in itself. We're interested in the idea. The mind cannot reach the thing in itself. Surely you should know this. If you don't know this, then you belong in some vulgar disciplinary department, not in the Committee on Social Thought. So, apart from some ambivalent humanistic types from history and social thought, it's pretty clear that the great minds of the social sciences division think that definitively latke is the preferred food group. And I want to first thank my colleagues and thank Renee Bassick and Anna Gregg for their help producing this marvelous proof of the superiority of the latke. And I'd also like to offer my apologies to the organizers of the Latke-Hamantash Debate, because after this definitive demolishing of any alternative opinion, I don't really see how we can have future debates in future years.
Our next debater is an expert on the literature and philosophy from the period of the Roman Emperor Nero, who, according to the Talmud, no word of a lie, in Masechet Gittin, personal favorite of many of us here tonight, converted to Judaism and whose descendant was Rabbi Meir. The Talmud tells us that all anonymous Mishnahs are attributed to Rabbi Meir. To my mind, that defeats the idea of offering anonymous Mishnahs in the first place. It may, however, have been a way of testing out the Mishnahs first. If they got a good laugh among the men of the Great Assembly, then Rabbi Meir would have been happy to claim them as his own. Shadi Bartsch-Zimmer is the Helen Regenstein Distinguished Service Professor of Classics and the Program in Gender Studies. She's also Director of the Stavanovich Institute on the Formation of Knowledge. Professor Bartsch-Zimmer.
Good evening, everybody. When I was offered the choice of championing the latke or the Hamantash tonight, the answer seemed obvious. On the one hand, you have a food whose fundamental ingredient is so necessary that millions died without it during the Irish potato famine of 1845 to 49. On the other hand, you have a cookie whose most popular filling is made from the poppy seed, a product also responsible for heroin, drug wars, and millions of deaths. No potatoes? Bad. No poppy seeds? Good. Quod erat demonstrandum. But then I remembered with great dismay that today's distinguished speakers are supposed to defend their chosen food from the point of view of their academic discipline, not just on its own merits. I say with great dismay because my field is ancient Greek and Roman literature and culture, specifically the Neronian period, and not only did the Romans not have latkes, but the potato itself was unknown to them. I was hoping that when the Romans went off to Jerusalem to destroy the temple in 70 AD, they might have stopped along the way to try a few tasty potato snacks, but no such luck. As we say in Latin, oive maximus. In fact, the first Europeans to discover the potato were the Spanish conquistadors who invaded the New World in the 16th century. They found this root vegetable in popular use in Chile and Peru, and they took it back to Europe with them for cultivation. This happened roughly 15 centuries after the reign of Nero in the 1st century AD, which, as I'm sure you know, was from 54 to 68 AD. This means that despite the family resemblance, Nero never ate a potato. This presented me with an immediate crisis. I was a classics professor speaking up for the latke, and I had no potatoes to speak with. Of course, the absence of the potato in ancient Rome might have been good from the potato's point of view, since we don't know exactly how Nero would have reacted to its import from South America. The potato might never have survived in the West if for some reason it offended the emperor. That's a potato. You see that, right? Okay. So in order to proceed, I must ask your indulgence to speak about Roman root vegetables in general. Things like potatoes, for example, beets, turnips, parsnips, all closely related to potatoes. And I assure you that if the Romans did have potatoes, they would have treated them with the same reverence as we moderns, and they would have made wonderful latkes out of them. Now that I've made my confession, let me turn to the virtues of the latke and the moral failings of the Hamantash. Let's start with the latke, the alpha and omega of all human progress. First, you will notice an uncanny similarity between the woven texture of the latke with its intercrossing potato fibers and one of the first marks of Western civilization, the woven fabric. Here you see one of the world's oldest pieces of cloth, the 2,800-year-old Lusahøj textile from the National Museum of Denmark. This roughly woven cloth, found in 1861, was wrapped around cremated human remains as a shroud. It is a dense and balanced weave, with approximately 16 threads per centimeter in both thread directions. The fiber material was originally identified as flax, while later studies suggested that it might be nettle. Even the naked eye, however, can tell that it's made from potato plants. This discovery is directly linked to the birth of agriculture in Europe, since the production of plant fiber textiles in ancient Europe was associated with human beings starting to farm textile plants domestically in order to provide a stable source of clothing. In other words, the need to weave drove the development of human civilization from a crude hunter-gatherer state to cultivated agriculture. And in fact, not only in Europe, but everywhere, weaving was an essential part of human progress. It later led to sheep breeding for wool, and I hardly need to point out that it's a short step from that to the telephone and the internet. So on the one hand, we have the intricately woven strands of potato that make up the latke. On the other hand, we have the Lusahøj fabric, both designed to sustain human life and both uncannily alike in structure, pattern, and shape. Here we see the root vegetable and weaving come together in a stunning parallel that suggests that the latke itself is the perfect metaphor for civilization. It is a root vegetable that has been woven. It is a beautiful thing. Don't let me stop here. For the ancient Greeks and Romans, weaving wool had even greater significance, if that can be imagined. That is, it wasn't just the sign that their civilization had developed to a certain state. It was a metaphor even within their own culture for the writing of poetry, the politics of the city-state, and the harmony of good leadership. Ancient poets refer to their compositions as consisting of the web and warp of song, borrowing terminology directly from the loom. And that concept is paralleled in Latin, which uses the vocabulary of textum and texere, which originally meant to weave, but now stands for a text or writing. Okay. Some scholars have even suggested that the prevalence of the language of texere, which of course we still use today when we speak of a text, is due to the presence of the letter X in the middle of the word. I quote, "No letter more precisely suggests the myth of weaving better than the X, the crossing of opposing threads," end quote. What else does the crisscrossed X of the latke stand for? Now that we've established its relationship to weaving, can it be coincidental that in the Odyssey, the clever Penelope wove by day and unraveled by night the shroud that she was weaving for her father-in-law, Laertes? As you'll recall, she had promised she would marry one of the suitors once the cloth was finished. Hence her nightly labor to keep the suitors at bay, while her husband, Odysseus, was wandering across the Mediterranean. Penelope's wool work thus stands not only for cleverness and industry, but also, of course, for chastity, since she used it to preserve hers. X is for chastity. Finally, further literary evidence from the ancient world also suggests that weaving can stand for the body politic, in this way bridging the private world of the ancient woman with the public civic world of the man. Consider Aristophanes' play Lysistrata, in which the women of Sparta refused to have sex with their husbands until they stopped the Peloponnesian War with Athens. And note again here the theme of chastity. The Spartan heroine Lysistrata not only gets the women of Athens and the other city-states to follow suit on the no-sex policy, she also encourages the takeover of the state itself by women. As she tells her unhappy husband, "It might not be so idiotic as you think to run the whole city entirely on the model of the way we deal with wool." She then describes a weaving government analogy to show how women would be better rulers than men. I'm going to quote it, and I hope that our incoming politicians take good notice. "The first thing you do with wool is you wash the grease out of it. You can do the same with a city. Then you stretch out the citizen body on a bench, and you pick out the burrs, that is, the parasites. After that, you prize apart the club members who form themselves into knots and clots to get into power, and when you've separated them, you pick them out one by one. Then you're ready for the carding. They can all go into the basket of civic goodwill, including the resident aliens and any foreigners who are your friends. Yes, and even those who are in debt to the treasury. Not only that, Athens has many colonies. At the moment, these are lying all over the place like stray bits of wool. You should pick them up and bring them here, put them together, and then out of all of this, make an enormous great ball of wool, and from that, you can make the people a coat," end quote. My point is here that weaving and political life go hand in hand. As scholars have suggested, only weaving could represent the unifying of opposite political stances, the tangled intrigues of statesmanship, the necessity of mending rifts between prominent families, and the suturing of differences to form a single harmonious society. We need some weavers in American democracy today. But let's return to our latke, which I hope has not gotten too lost from our view. It's time to examine the second ancient perspective on the latke, and this is the medical perspective. Yes, latkes were medicine, or at least they would have been. Contrary to the situation in our post-antibiotic world, In antiquity, generally speaking, most of what was used as medicine was, in fact, food. As the ancients saw it, foodstuffs played two roles. On the one hand, they were a nutrient necessary for life to provide the wherewithal for growth. On the other hand, they could act as drugs, as pharmaca, or better still, as pharmacological agents, with an effect, good or bad, upon the physiological processes of the body. So if foodstuffs are medicine, which foodstuff had the best medical effect for humans? The answer, of course, is the root vegetables, the turnips and beets that were the Romans' proto-potatoes. To prove this, we need only consult two famous ancient physicians and their handbooks, Pliny the Younger and Cornutus Celsus. I have saved you the work of reading through these rather long, dry tomes on the medical properties of various vegetables, herbs, and small animals, and I have put together a summary of the properties of root vegetables for your edification. So the turnip cures gout. Radish skins eliminate gallstones. Radishes are also good for intestinal hernias. They also get rid of head lice. Beets are the cure for creeping sores of the genitals. Turnips cure ulcerated sores, and mini radishes, whatever those are, cure jaundice. Please note here the utility of beets for STDs. Isn't it depressing that for centuries people risked their lives by taking doses of mercury to cure their syphilis when all they needed to do was eat a few beets? Beets were also acknowledged as being very good for constipation. They were specifically prescribed for stomach problems caused by an excess of rich food because of their purgative side effects. So we find in the third book of Apicius's cookbook that beet dishes are twice recommended as laxatives, and in this, Apicius is in accord with the medical advice of Galen and Pliny. Poppy seeds, as you will see shortly, have the opposite effect, clogging up the system by their sedative powers. So to wrap up the latke, I will just add that, like their fellow root vegetables, potatoes contain a wealth of health benefits that make them an essential dietary item for most of the world's population. As modern doctors acknowledge, potatoes improve digestion, reduce cholesterol levels, boost heart health, protect from polyps, prevent cancer, manage diabetes, strengthen the immune system, reduce signs of aging, protect the skin, increase circulation, reduce blood pressure, maintain fluid balance, reduce insomnia, and boost eye health. Don't forget the last one, boost eye health. It will be very important. I now turn to squishing the unhealthy Hamantash with a few well-placed observations. Do you remember when Elaine on Seinfeld failed a drug test? It was in the 1996 episode called The Showerhead. Do you remember why Elaine failed the drug test? Exactly. She had eaten a large poppy seed muffin before taking the drug test. This is not a myth, it is medical reality. You can potentially fail a drug test if you eat a poppy seed Hamantash. But since the university has overlooked the importance of testing assistant professors for opium levels as part of the tenure process, I'm willing to put this reason for avoiding poppy seed Hamantaschen aside. There are many other reasons. We were just speaking of the properties of beets, for example, and we can learn from modern medicine that poppy seeds without beets are a bad dietary call. We can learn this from the internet site Physicians Who Listen. I quote, "One cannot, or at least should not, eat poppy seed Hamantaschen alone. Whether we are talking about opium, heroin, or just poppy seed filling, they all cause constipation. This is one of the reasons why you need to have some good root vegetables lying around. But let us go back to the ancients again for the real reason to avoid Hamantaschen. I promise that these reasons will shock and dismay you, and that you will never look at Hamantaschen in the same way again. First of all, you should know, or you may already know, that the Romans loved rich food and heavy banqueting. I'm sure you know it because of all those movies with Romans barfing in vomitoria. I show you here a typical Roman luxury food. Dormice sprinkled with poppy seeds. It's taken right out of Apicius's cookbook. These poor hamster-like animals were sprinkled with poppy seed and honey and were served with hot sausages on a silver gridiron, underneath which were damson plums and pomegranate seeds. Note the damn poppy seeds again. This is no accident. Poppy seeds were part of the luxury diet, a delicious and exotic flavoring. At the same time, Roman moralists deplored the sign of corruption and professed to be shocked at the very banquets with ostriches and peacocks and turtles and Hamantaschen that they described in severe terms. Among the moralizers, ancient doctors in particular warned of the physical degeneration that followed a diet of rich food, and they linked it to swellings in the joints. They were not wrong, if you'll recall Henry VIII and his gout. Henry VIII ate rich food and voila, gout, which, as you know, produces painful joint swellings, especially in the big toe. Diet plays a key role in increasing the chances of developing gout, and the usual advice is to avoid high purine foods because they raise uric acid levels, and uric acid causes gout. But more recently, medical research has made a direct connection between gout and sugar. Fructose both increases the production of uric acid and reduces the body's ability to get rid of it. That is, sugar and gout are directly linked. Pastries and gout are directly linked. Hamantaschen and gout are directly linked. What is amazing is that ancient doctors already knew this. The good Dr. Celsus warns us that anything that is sweet is bad for digestion and the body. Most of it is consumed precisely because it tastes so good. So both the foodstuff itself and overindulgence in it lead to deleterious effects upon one's health. They don't only produce gout, but a whole host of diseases. And now I'm going to read to you a description of what the side effects of this kind of oversweet eating are. This is from Seneca, letter 95. From this came pallor, and the trembling of muscles drenched in wine. The guy was eating wine and Hamantash. And emaciation from digestion worse than that from hunger. From this came the unsteady steps of tottering men, and always a staggering like drunkenness itself. From this came dropsy throughout all the skin, and a distended belly that isn't used to taking in more than it can hold. From this, a spreading of yellow bile, an immaculated face, and the rot of bodies decaying inwardly, and fingers gnarly with their stiffening joints, and an inertia of muscles lying there without sensation or spasming without relief. Why mention dizziness in the head? Or agony in the eyes and ears, and itchiness in one's fevered brain, and the affliction of the parts we use for defecation with ulcers, and innumerable sorts of fevers besides. As I move to my last and decisive rebuttal of any half-baked Hamantaschen lovers, let me remind you here that ancient medicine in antiquity and long after was based on the theory of the humors. As you can see from this slide, humorism was a system of medicine that posited that we are each full of 4 distinct body fluids: black bile, yellow bile, phlegm, and blood. Your humors increased or decreased depending on your diet, and eating too much of the wrong thing could therefore affect both your personality and your physical health. as Seneca just spelled out for us. The reason that eating too much of certain foods like Hamentaschen is bad for you is that it leads to a buildup of certain byproducts from the humors, and these byproducts, like uric acid, can devastate the body. What are the main byproducts of eating too much of the wrong kind of food? I will cite for you just one illustrative example from Aristotle. He and certain other sources maintain that certain kinds of rich foods, such as the Hamentaschen, cause the humor blood to convert to its byproduct, which I'm very sorry to say is semen. According to Aristotle and other medical experts, not only is semen a residue made after foods transition into blood, but this residue is stored in a particular part of the body. And again, I quote, "It is the region around the eyes that is the most full of seed." For the region around the eyes is, of all the head, that which is most nearly connected with the generative secretions. A proof of this is that it alone is visibly changed in sexual intercourse, and those who indulge too much in this are seen to have their eyes sunken in. You know, the semen all dissipates, and then your eyes sink in. The reason it's stored there is that semen is like the brain, for its material is watery, the heat being acquired later. To sum up, an excess of sweet food creates unhealthy blood, which converts to an excess of semen, and the inevitable result is, I dread to say it, leakage from the eyes. You've heard of crocodile tears. This condition is far worse. And you will recall, I hope, that I mentioned the fact that potatoes lead to eye health as a very important touch. I think this is the right note to end on. So let us conclude. Our investigation has shown that the latke stands for poetry, civilization, and statesmanship, and that all root vegetables are good for the body, while the consumption of Hamentaschen, especially poppy seed Hamentaschen, causes constipation, maculation of the face, jaundice, tooth decay, gout and arthritis, internal rot of the body, ulcers and boils, semen buildup behind the eyes, and ultimately death. With a list of such reactions as these, we can now safely speculate in a way dared by no previous historian about that most mysterious of historical cataclysms, the fall of Rome. Rome fell in 476 AD. But why? The English historian Edward Gibbon, who wrote in the late 18th century, blames the rise of Christianity and its effect on the Roman psyche. Other scholars have suggested that the decline and fall was inevitable due to the influx of barbarians from the north. Today, we have seen that a hitherto unacknowledged reason for Rome's topple from her heights can be traced back to a growing taste for an insidious hidden invader. We now know the worst. The harmful, flesh-eating Hamantash caused the fall of Rome. Thank you.
Okay, our last speaker tonight is Anne Rogers. Professor Rogers is an associate professor of computer science. She's director of the master's program in computer science and the faculty co-director of the computational analysis and public policy master's program. When she was director of the PhD program, she would often tell students that you start graduate school with a vision of my dissertation, the movie, and end graduate school with my dissertation, the pretty good short story. Tonight, perhaps, my dissertation, the joke. Professor Rogers.
am Ann Rogers. I do not stand still. My students will tell you that I start every class that I teach every quarter at the university. I've been here about 15 years by saying, I'm Ann Rogers. I talk fast and I swear. I'm from the East Coast. We talk fast, we swear. We also have very strong opinions. So even though you could pick me up and you could drop me in Dublin and no one would look at me and say, that person isn't Irish, I do have, in fact, a very strong opinion about the question of latkes and hamantaschen. In fact, my family is very big fans of this debate. And I have always sat when they were planning to go thinking, what is there to debate? And tonight, actually, there isn't a debate because I'm on Team Latke and all of and my fellow speakers are also on Team Latke. So it's a little strange, but that's OK. I'm told there is a clicker here. I also wanted to say that, but there is a good reason why I was chosen, so I'm obviously not Jewish. But I was born in Newark. So I was born on the East Coast, but I was born in Newark, New Jersey. And for those of you who don't know anything about Newark, it was the home of Philip Roth and was, in fact, in the 60s, before the 60s, into the 60s, a place that had a tremendous amount of Jewish culture and tradition woven through the fabric of the city. So even though I grew up in the Vailsburg section of Newark, which was full of Irish Catholic Copts and firemen, it was not uncommon to hear Yiddish because that was just part of the city. And so I have opinions. And in fact, my opinion is that I'm interested in latkes. So also, I grew up in an Irish family, and you have a choice in an Irish family. You either learn to hate potatoes, or you learn to think that potatoes should be served at every meal, preferably 2 or 3 different kinds. So I got this invitation, and I was really tremendously honored to have been asked. It is I wouldn't quite say it's the Nobel Prize, because I'm a computer scientist, and we don't have one of those. But it was, in fact, a big honor to be asked, and so I said yes. And then it was one of those moments when you hit send, and you think, OK, can I please reach down through the wire and pull that back? Because I didn't really think there was anything to debate. And so how was I going to stand up here and say for a long period of time in this very scholarly way, which I have to say, people from Newark don't do that so much. In this very scholarly way, how do computer scientists think about latkes and hamantaschen? So this was an issue. But also, I had a little bit of an existential crisis because it's not clear what I am. I am a trained computer scientist, as well was pointed out, but also I have done administration at the university for a long time, and I am by vocation really an educator. And so I thought, well, all right, I'll start as a computer scientist and see if in my role as a computer scientist I can come up with a way to argue for latkes. And so computer scientist, at a very broad brush for my colleagues, I apologize for those of you who are here, think about things in one of 2 ways. So either you have beautiful handwriting and you prove things for a living. As my students will tell you, I do not have beautiful handwriting, and I do not prove things for a living. So I wasn't going to do this, thanks to my colleague, John Simon, who does have beautiful handwriting. Doing that, so OK. So the other thing that you do as a computer scientist is, if you don't write proofs, you write code. So, all right, so I'm going to write some code. And so now the question is, well, what code to write to prove that latkes are the right thing? So as you well know, big data is a big thing out in the world these days. And thought, oh, OK, well, I should do big data, because that's what computer scientists are supposed to do these days. And so I thought, well, all right, if I'm going to do big data, then I should decide, well, maybe we'll let the web decide. Are latkes or hamantaschen better? And so I thought, all right, well, how do I do this? I'm going to do this by writing some code to figure out, are there more pictures of latkes on the web, or are there more pictures of hamantaschen on the web? All right, so how do you do this? So like, whenever you do this kind of task, what you have to do is you have to go out and find training samples. And of course, you have to not eat them. So you have to find training samples. So here is my training latke. So we have to ask, well, what makes it a latke? And as the previous people have pointed out, really what makes a latke is that it's a circle. All right, so we will look for circles, and we will see whether or not we think they're correctly labeled as latkes. Of course, and as we know, hamantaschen are triangles. I would have made them red had I collaborated with my colleagues before, but we're going to go for blue. OK, so here's how we're going to tell. So the first question is, so my students will tell you that I like people to respond when I ask questions. I just stand and stare at them until one of them responds. So you need to respond. So they're going to be questions. And it's very important that you give the right answer, because I might laugh at you. All right, so we're going to go through and we're going to look at some latkes and hamentaschen, and we're going to ask, what are they? Okay, so what is this, a latke or a hamentaschen? You're not supposed to get the right answer. You're supposed to get the wrong answer, folks. I say this to my students all the time. Please give me the wrong answer so that I can explain to you the reason why you're wrong. All right, but no, you've obviously gotten the joke, so this is a latke, because, of course, it's a circle. All right, so, but what about this one, latke or a hamentaschen? Right, it's clearly a hamentaschen because it is a triangle. All right, so, like, you know, maybe this going with the shape thing is not working so well, but we'll keep going and see what happens. So, what do we look at next? Well, next we get, what is this? Obviously, it's neither. It's a kippah. But we're going to call it a latke, because clearly it is round. So maybe the problem here is not so much shape, but in this case, maybe I should have just stuck to things that are food. All right, so we'll move on to something that looks more like food. So what is this one? Well, I was actually really, really pleased with this one for two reasons. One, it's clearly not just a hamantash, a single hamantash, it's many hamentaschen, right? So this was a good thing. But also, you'll notice there that my system, this very carefully designed system on which I spent hours and hours, was not fooled by the hidden latke, which unfortunately does not line up the way one would hope. All right, so this clearly, like many things having to do with big data, there was a lot of hype here, and maybe it's not the most successful approach to deciding latkes versus hamentaschen. So we're going to move on from big data. And so my role as a computer scientist maybe didn't work out as well as I would have hoped, so we'll try administrator. And you don't really want to watch me push paper from one side of my desk to the other, which is what I normally do in my role as an administrator. So we'll talk about budgets, because we all know budgets are really very funny. Okay. So we're going to do a cost-benefit analysis of the question of latke versus hamentaschen, and we're going to figure out which of these will give us the right answer. Okay, so what are, there's a whole series of official steps you're supposed to do, I learned from Wikipedia, when you do a cost-benefit analysis. And so what are our alternatives? Well, our alternatives are clearly latkes and hamentaschen. Who are the stakeholders? The members of the university community. This all seems fine so far, a little dull, but moving on. What are the appropriate measurements? Now, this one is quite difficult, right? What do you measure when you're trying to figure out which of these is the right one to choose? So, well, we've got ingredients and labor, and there's actually a very funny, long discussion that's a feminist history of why latkes are better than hamentaschen, and I should have cited it because I'm a scholar, but I didn't. But you should look it up, because it actually is pretty funny. It is not from the University of Chicago, and for that I apologize. But then there's, of course, increased consumer satisfaction, which is important in this particular thing. You need to predict the relevant outcomes over the period of time. Well, everybody's going to eat too much no matter what it is. There are other very, very boring steps to this discussion. We're going to skip those, because this really is not working well either way. And so now we're just going to say, all right, what is our cost-benefit analysis recommendation? All right. So clearly they're going to be latkes, because it's the right answer. But we have this problem that, you may not know this, but I went this afternoon to the Council of the Faculty Senate meeting, which is these very serious faculty members having very serious discussions about very serious things, including today, the budget. And what I learned at this meeting, and I've learned at every meeting I've been to on the budget, is that, actually, you can have one of latkes or hamentaschen, but you can't have both applesauce and sour cream, and you can't have that many latkes, because let's face it, the budget is really tight. This did not work all that well either, right? It's a little funny, it's not that funny. So I move on to my third identity, which is that really at its heart, what I am is an educator. Right? Really what I do, the thing that makes me get up in the morning and decide I want to go off to the university, is that I teach people how to think computationally. Now, some of my students are here. Welcome. Thank you for coming. And what they would tell you is, so I could give you sort of a typical Ann Rogers lecture, which I'm actually doing a pretty good imitation of. I talk fast, I swear. I wander. I do all those things. But the problem with that is that giving a lecture like that and saying whether latkes or hamentaschen are better would be very difficult, because mostly those lectures consist of yada, 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 abstract. Yada, 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 abstract, like as a verb, right? Most of you probably don't use abstract as a verb. I would say things like write functions, and that's not all that fun either. But I realized that over the course of the quarter, students will very frequently say to me, you know, Professor Rogers, what's the right answer? Like, do I do it this way or I do it that way? And I constantly say to them, well, it depends. Like, these things are often a matter of opinion. And so that brought me back to this question of this debate, right? Is there really a debate here? And is there a right answer? And so I thought I would pick a few things that computer scientists like to have debates about that probably most of you will think, who the fuck cares? But we do, in fact, actually care very deeply about these questions and argue about them for long periods of time for no good reason. OK, so the first of these is so the first of these is tabs versus spaces. So for those of you who don't know, when you write code, and I'm actually giving a whole lecture here and not showing you a single line of code. Fortunately, one of my students brought some code with her on a sign. So we have code in the room, so we're safe. But when you write code, you have to decide, you have to indent, 2 spaces, 4 spaces. Right? So the question is, do you use spaces or do you use tabs? And so now I'll show you a quick video on exactly this topic, which hopefully will work.
Richard, what's wrong?
Nothing. Nothing. Literally, it's all good.
Oh, no.
Come on.
Oh, my God.
I'm sorry.
Your roommates were right. You really hate spaces.
No. I don't. It's not hate. Hate's a strong word. Truth be told, I do have a slight preference for tabs.
So actually, people really do care about this. And I have to tell you that I'm in a mixed marriage. So I'm a spaces gal. My husband is a tabs guy. We managed to get along, sort of. Yeah. All right, so the next question that people discuss, and this one is really like you want to start a flame war among computer scientists, look at them in this sort of very innocent way and say, so I need to pick an editor. Like, what editor should I choose to write my code? And so we can ask that question.
I mean, why not just use Vim over Emacs?
I do use Vim over Emacs.
Oh, God help us.
And again, I'm in a mixed marriage. Like, God invented Emacs for a reason. I don't know where Vim came from. But my husband's a Vim guy, and I do love him. All right, and then the last question is choice of programming language. Again, this is a topic on which people have very, very strong opinions. And sometimes it actually really matters, actually. If you want your code to go wicked fast, and you don't want it to stop to garbage collect, for instance, because you're on the space shuttle, then you probably want to go with something like C. Or you might be interested in a trendy language. You want to be able to write on your resume that you can program in Swift or Go or Lua. I think that's how you pronounce it. I'm a little old for that one. Then you're going to go with one of those. Or you might go with some tried and true thing. But people there are good reasons to have opinions on this particular topic, and there are right solutions in some situations and wrong solutions in some situations. And I guess in the end, I looked at these questions and I said, sometimes there's a right answer. Right? Sometimes you look at a question and people think there's a debate, like tabs versus spaces, and there's really a right answer. And you really should treat people with respect and dignity. There's a right answer to that. Right? There's no debate there, and yet somehow in our country today there is a debate, and there shouldn't be. And sometimes there's actually a real reason to have a debate, like what is the right programming language to use for a topic. And so I think I kind of want to end on the note of it's important for us to understand when is there a debate that we really should have and think deeply about, and when are we just going to argue because it's fun. I will end on the note that I'm on Team Latka, and I am on a committee, and I was sitting around talking to my fellow committee members, none of whom are computer scientists, and I said, so I'm doing the Latke-Hamantaschen debate, and I'm very nervous, and I don't have any computer science jokes because it's not really a computer science kind of thing, and so I don't know what to do. And one of my fellow committee members said, he said, Anne, this is very straightforward. He said, when you grate potatoes, you get bits, they turn into bytes, and so latkes win. So thank you very much.
Well, that was one-sided. But I think if we've learned anything in the past few weeks, it's that there are no foregone conclusions in any polls. So the words have been spoken. Now it is for the stomachs to decide at the reception in Hutch. Entry to the reception costs $5. Note that your entry to this debate was entirely free. That, the organizers apparently believe, is a fair reflection of the relative value of these two events. Now, this was pretty one-sided, but let's not kid ourselves that this has been definitive. This debate will go on. For how much longer? Well, the Chicago Cubs had to wait 108 years for their relief. So we have at least 38 years left, if not another 70. But for tonight, the moment of judgment between Latke and Hamantash is upon us. In Mandel Hall, it is written, and in Hutchinson Commons, it is sealed. Who will be devoured? And who will be disavowed? Who will be eaten for lunch? And who will be left in the lurch? Who will be retweeted? And who will have retreated? Who will be polished off? And who will be poo-pooed? Who will be eaten? And who will get beaten? Who will be snacked upon? And who will be snubbed? Who will be demolished? And who will be disregarded? Who will be fated? And who will get wasted? Who will be deemed delicious? And who considered disgusting? Who will be called incredible? And who considered inedible? Who will be raised up and chomped down? And who will be forced down and thrown up? Which is up to you to decide.
Good evening, everyone. I hope you all enjoyed the debate. My name is Dahlia LaFell, and I'm the president of Hillel's Student Leadership Board. And I would just like to say that I was thoroughly impressed by all of our debaters tonight. However, I will say that as a longtime fan of the Hamantash, I think it deserves a little credit. While, as has been proven tonight, the latke is a hearty contender, we must remember that variety is the spice of life, and the Hamantash sure brings variety. I mean, who doesn't love a good poppy seed cookie? Or how about apricot? Even the prune ones get things moving. Now, this debate has been going on for 70 years here at the University of Chicago, and although tonight may have favored the latke, I have faith that next year, the Hamantash will make a strong and impressive showing. Over the years, we've had somewhere around 250 debaters on this stage. And that, of course, means at least 500 opinions on the matter. But that really is the beauty of the debate, asking the big, important questions and concluding nothing. I'd like to thank Hal for hosting and the esteemed debaters for their compelling latke presentations. I think we all learned a lot. Thank you to Jen Kennedy and Christy Owens from the Reynolds Club and the Seminary Co-op Bookstore for their support. Thank you to Carl Fogel for his accompaniment this evening and UChicago Creative for their help in making this event available to people across the country. I would especially like to thank all of our volunteers for making the event possible and Rachel Jackson for her striking designs. And finally, I would like to extend an immense amount of gratitude to Rebecca Mogilevsky for all of her hard work in making tonight happen. I would now like to invite you all to taste for yourselves who the true winner should be, and join us for a reception in Hutchinson Commons, where you can sample latkes and hamantaschen alike. Remember also to vote for your favorite on the inserts in your pamphlets. And okay, now if I could ask you to please remain seated while our debaters process out. Thank you all for coming, and have a happy Thanksgiving.